Thanks very much, Pam. Kia katoa. As you probably gathered listening to me, I'm from New Zealand. I've lived in Australia 3 times and I continue to work in both countries, and it's just fantastic to be back here in Tasmania. I've got a special place for Tasmania. I've spent quite a lot of time here and worked with a number of your companies. And it was the opportunity this afternoon. I've been brought back to Tasmania by the Australian Insurance Lawyers Association, and we're doing a masterclass this afternoon with them around some of the shifts that are happening in ageing workforces, and particularly the impacts in terms of workers' compensation and what's happening for substantial growth in terms of the number of people post 50 who are actually ending up exiting the workforce through lump sum settlements. So we want to talk something about that in terms of longevity. But I approached Pam and John Finesse and Cameron and just said, look, there's an opportunity. I've been doing some presentations around global trends in age and work. So what I want to talk with you this morning is really a thought leadership piece. It's not about what you do in your workplaces. It's not about what you do if you're an older worker. All that is other types of workshops. This is really just some top level thinking in terms of the shifts that we're seeing happening internationally in this space. And I guess this presentation started by, if anybody knows New Zealand, there's a small rural provincial community in the south of the South Island called Gore. In actual fact, there's a guy who started a website. I don't know if anybody's ever done this place, it's in Australia, but he started a website called the SH Places to Live in New Zealand. And Gore is kind of in that list. But it's a fantastic rural community. And they said, come down and give us a presentation on global trends in age and work, which I did. And then in June, I was very, very privileged to be invited to Washington, DC, to be on a panel with ARP, the World Economic Forum, and OECD, to talk about some of the things that are happening in terms of age and work and some of the thinking we're doing. So that tended to help me solidify this thinking. 2 weeks ago, I made this presentation to a number of New Zealand government agencies, and so I thought it was just a great opportunity to share it with you guys. So can I just get a sense? Well, the other thing I'm going to say is Pam's arranged for this to be recorded, but the understanding we've reached is at the point when you want to have interaction with me, the recording stops. So it's a recording of me, not of you. Is that fair enough? And before it goes up on the website, we'll just check that there's no one else on it except me. Is that fine? And places where I have interaction, we'll probably edit that out too, but that's a job down the back. So can I just get a sense of where people come from and what your roles are? So just very quickly.
I'm the Director of Criminal Culture.
Yep, okay, yep. Know the organisation.
I'm a graduate in HR Justice.
Yep, okay.
Which is Tasmania.
And your role?
Activating project.
Oh, okay, cool. Yep.
I just commenced for a project on PTSD.
Yep. Okay, that's going to be a topic this afternoon, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mark and Julianne are talking about it. Yeah.
Mineral Resources Tasmania is in the regulation of the mining and exploration industry.
Yep, okay.
Principal Inspector of Work Health and Safety.
Yep.
Department of Education and Diversity and Inclusion Project.
Oh, brilliant. You're going to hear some stuff I'm going to talk about where I'm no longer talking about diversity and inclusion, but I'm talking about inclusion and diversity. So we'll talk about that this morning.
Inspector, WorkSafe.
Yep.
Inspector with WorkSafe dealing predominantly with workers' comp.
Yep.
Project Manager of Skills TAS on Regional Workforce Development.
Brilliant.
WorkSafe Tasmania looking after industry safety.
Yep.
Justice, Director of Project Management.
Yep.
Justice Department, licensing of building practitioners, customer services officer.
Yep. And I know this character, but you might not know Cameron.
Police, fire and emergency, and project managing wellbeing.
Yep.
WorkSafe, injury data.
Yep.
WorkSafe Inspector.
WorkSafe Projects and Business Services.
WorkSafe Advisor.
And I want to introduce Dennis Crispin to you. Dennis works for Busy at Work. We've worked a lot with Busy at Work in Queensland, and Busy at Work have got a contract for a program called Skills Checkpoint. I've got it right this time. For older workers. And it's a resource that I want to make you aware of and give you the opportunity to meet Dennis too as part of this, because it's a fantastic resource that the Commonwealth Government have put in around helping people at points of transition, at points of risk actually in terms of employment. Okay, well, really interesting group of people. So let's get into this. And there'll be a few points where, just jump in actually if you want to ask me questions. And I'll watch the clock to make sure we're out of here by 10:30. How does that sound? Okay, so where I want to go is to really say up front that there's there's a shift that is happening in terms of the way we're thinking about ageing, the way we're thinking about ageing workforces and ageing populations. And at this stage, it's a very subtle shift, but I want to bring some of that subtlety to you today to be thinking quite differently in this space and responding quite differently. This guy, Chris Farrell's written a really, really interesting book. He's written a number of books, but he's written one called Unretirement. And really saying is actually we need to rethink this whole thing of retirement, and that we're in a very interesting transition phase at the moment, where we understand the constructs and the way of talking and thinking here, but over here there's a whole new language and a new way of thinking that we need to get into, and I want to bring up some of that to you. So where I want to go this morning is I want to talk a little bit about longevity and what that's about. A rethinking of retirement is basically the second trend. Third trend is a focus on ageism, and I want to spend a little time on that. But I want to open it up in quite a different way to what you traditionally hear the discussion on ageism. There's also been a lot of talk, and probably I know in your country and certainly in my country, around the future of work, but very, very little talk about the future workforce. And that's what I want to talk about. And the numbers there, I'm giving a heads up, are really scary in terms of, in actual fact, the availability of labour. And that's going to force us, I think, very soon, right now, to be rethinking. And Cameron and I were talking to someone yesterday where these issues were starting to come up here in Tasmania. If you think you've got skill shortages now, just think about the future. Then I want to talk a bit about age inclusiveness and what's happening in that space, particularly in terms of moving to much more intergenerational, multi-generational initiatives. So that's the kind of space I go, and I want to end up with a short video from one of my mentors, a guy called Mark Friedman. So that's the journey. So if we start to think about longevity, actually I'm going to tell you a story first. We'll go backwards on that one. I was running a workshop in New Zealand for a large retailer, and we were talking about the fact that people are living longer. And this woman said, "Can I tell you a story?" I said, "Well, okay, I'm always on for a story." And this is one of those stories that kind of tells the story, I reckon, of what's happening in longevity. And she said that her and her husband were over from New Zealand. They were staying at Noosa up in Queensland, up in the Sunshine Coast. And they wanted to go down to Brisbane, so they drove across to Nambour and got on the train. And they were sitting on the train, and just across from them, there was an older woman sitting there. And it was, you know how you have on trains those seats that kind of face each other, so you're sitting facing each other? The next stop down the road line, a young mother got on with a child who she estimates was probably about 5 or 6, a little boy. And this little boy started staring at this older lady. And after a little way further down the line, he just couldn't contain himself. And he looked at this older lady and he said to her, "How old are you?" And she looked back, and everybody kind of waited with bated breath. What was she going to say? And she looked back at him and she said, "I'm 67. And he thought, and you could see this little boy's mind ticking over, and he looked back at her and he said, "Then you must be nearly dead." And if you work back, she was born in 1947. Life expectancy for a woman born in 1947 was 71 years. 70 years and 10, nearly dead. But she wasn't, because she's now 67, and current life expectancy, she could be expecting to live into her 80s. But that's our mentality, is we're locked into thinking about the 70 years and 10. And he was absolutely spot on, but she wasn't. She was very much alive. So if we do look at life expectancy, do people ever do presentations and these screens drive you mad because you can go everywhere else except it gets absorbed on there? They've got to come up with one that works for these. So if you were born in 1890, as a female, you could expect to live for 51 years. Come up to 1955, you'd expect to live for 73 years. 86, 78. 2016, born in 2016, expected to live, all things being equal, to around an average of 85. Well, that's okay. You can see the amazing amount of life expectancy that's been built in there. But the more important number to look at when you talk about life expectancy is how long are people likely to live from the age of 65? Because if you take the numbers, someone born in 1950, the projections they do then are based on life expectancy at that time, all things being held equal. But we know that there's been huge improvements in terms of public health that are feeding into longevity. But even when you look at these numbers, that's as it is at the moment. But if you have a look in here, back in 1881, very few people actually made it to 77. But if a woman made it to 65, she could expect to live to 77. Come through here into the 60s. Someone making it through to 65 could in actual fact have another 15 years. Come here into 2014-16, making it through to 65, you could in actual fact expect another 20-25 years of living. And that's what we're dealing with, is that this in actual fact has changed. We're not nearly dead at 67. In actual fact, we're still very much alive. So the things that are starting to emerge in this whole discussion around the ageing of the population is that there's a subtle shift moving on, that we're no longer talking about, well, we're not talking so much now about the ageing population. We're not so much talking about the ageing of the workforce. What we're much more talking about is the implications and the impacts of longevity. We've just been involved in New Zealand. Our Minister of Seniors has just been developing a new strategy to replace a positive ageing strategy that was in place. And I've been involved as an independent advisor to that. And one of the things that just kept cropping up in the early drafts was, we need to prepare for this ageing population. And several of us were going back and saying, good God, get over it. We actually have a population that is aging. It's not a tsunami. It's what some of us call tsunami thinking. You know, you've heard that phrase used, the media often used it, you know, the tsunami of an age. That's nonsense. In actual fact, what we've got is not a lot more older people being older longer. We've got actual people putting together life in quite a different way. And that's the thing that we need to grasp. The other subtle shift that's happening in the way in which we're using language, and if you're ever involved in writing around this, you might want to think about it. Because everywhere in this draft strategy that the Minister had developed, where they had people over 65 or older people, I went through with a red pen, and I was invited to do this, and started writing down, as we age. Because the Minister was saying, she said, well, I want to be able to engage with people in their 40s, because this strategy is about them as they age. And then everywhere she talked about preparing for an ageing population, people over 65 and old people. Now I'm in the latter half of my 60s. To talk about people as older, it doesn't engage with me. But if you're to talk about people as they age, it engages me. And so again, as you're starting to think about this, not so much be talking about older workers, but be talking about people as they age at work. And suddenly you've got rid of that barrier, which is always about the other. But we all know we're aging, so engaging people as they age at work. And that starts to pull in. Now, I know government policy has, what's your age line? 45 to 70, Dennis? Yeah, someone said, you know, from 45, we've got to do this thing. The age older workers used to be 50, it's now down to 45. Do you know what drives that, where that number's come from? Do you know where that 45's come from? Well, where that's come from is the fact that if you lose a job after the age of 45, your chances of getting a job very quickly decline very significantly. So it's actually got nothing to do with life stages, it's got nothing to do with developmental psychology, it's everything to do with your chances of in actual fact getting re-employment. But suddenly an older person is someone who's over 45 as far as employment's concerned. What I'm saying is let's start talking about people as they age at work and getting rid of categories and the creation of others. And I'll come back to that. So, if this works, and it's worked really well, Pam. So one of the questions, or two questions I often ask people is, at the age of 60, you might only be 2/3 of the way through. How do you want to spend that next third of your life? I was working with a group of employees in a council up in southeast Queensland, and it was actually a group of managers, and I asked that question, at the age of 60, you may be only 2/3 of the way through, how do you want to spend the next third of your life? And I just heard a woman it was actually a very huge sigh of relief. And she said, I said, something struck a chord for you. And she said, yeah, what's struck a chord for me is that at 60, everybody was telling you about being 65 and being old. You've just opened up a whole new life stage for me, a whole different way of thinking. And that's again where I'm going to say a little bit later, we need to get rid of those barriers, those points calling 65 a kind of a destination. And after that, you've kind of into the golden dream or whatever. I don't know what it is because I'm over 65. So the question is, at 60, how do you want to spend that next 30 of your life? But from an employment point of view, I often say to people at the age of 50, you could be working for another 20, 25 years. What's that part of your career going to be about? And I guess that's what you talk to people about a lot, Dennis, in your program is, at this age of 45, 50, 60 even, how do you want the next part of your working life to look? And what are your options and your possibilities? And this afternoon, we're going to talk about that with the insurance lawyers and those who come to that. Because what I'm seeing in the data from Tasmania is the option that people are taking at that stage in life when they have injury is lump sum payments. And they're exiting from the workforce. Often, I would suspect, prematurely and not ready to, but still wanting to make a gainful contribution. But the possibilities for constructing work and contribution and participation are not explored to maybe the extent they need to be. So here we are in terms of, this is from the OECD, 2000 to 2016, just a short period over 16 years. And this is the gains in life expectancy with a health adjustment put in there. Over that period of just 16 years, Australia's had a gain of about 2.7 years. So that's quite significant, the sort of gain that is happening in terms of longevity for us. So what do you think are some of the implications for all life stages as a result of us now living longer? And I want you just to take a minute now just to talk to the person beside you and just think of one or two implications of the fact that we're now living potentially the 100-year life. So just talk to the person beside you about one or two implications. So what are some of the implications that you talked about between yourselves? Just fire them up.
There's a big gap between super on average for men and women.
Yeah.
So as we're living longer, we talked about particularly younger people still staying at home. So there's financial burden
the boomerangs.
living at home. And then if you were to phase out of the workforce, 20, 30 years of your life still left and your superannuation is significantly lower, your financial capacity is seriously reduced.
So it's got financial implications. Paul Keating actually said last year, he said when they designed the super system, they designed it at a stage when life expectancy was in the early 80s. And it was a system that was fit for purpose for about 10 to 15 years of living post-work. That's not the case any longer.
That's assuming you're also working a job where you superannuation.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the other thing that's emerging is the huge number, well, it's particularly women who've had time out of the workforce, but the huge contracting workforce where people are not required to make that provision. So there's financial implications. Okay, what are the implications?
The tax base, which has given us the better healthcare, will be eroded as more people exit the workforce.
It may or may not be. And I think that's an interesting one. That assumes that people stop contributing tax at age 65. Now, we've done some really good work in New Zealand to in actual fact show. New Zealand, for example, has a participation rate of 44% of people 65 to 69 still in the workforce, and 24% overall. You're sitting at around about 14%. So Australia's typically had a lower participation rate in the OECD, about number 12, 14, and we're number 2. Now, what the work they did in New Zealand has shown that the tax contribution from people remaining in work is very, very significant, because it's not only coming through PAYE tax or tax on salary and wages, earnings, but it's coming through consumption, because if they've got money they spend it, it's GST. But we also know that people tend to remain healthier because they're in actual fact actively engaged and socially connected. So while I think it is going to have an impact, I think it is overplayed at times. Look, I'll be blunt here. It's quite interesting working in two countries and also I've just come back from the States and I know what's happening in other countries. Australia has a very strong narrative around age and work. And that narrative has been defined by the superannuation industry. And that's why I was interested when I asked you what were the implications. The first one we got was what? Finance. That's what you'll hear in Australia. That's what people think. What do? They do retirement planning. No, they don't. They do financial planning, but they call it retirement planning. Okay, another implication.
If you pull the pin, how do you keep yourself busy?
Yeah. So it's purposeful, and what we'll show in a little video later, but what Mark Friedman talks about is the two important things that to keep us healthy and engaged are both to have a sense of purpose and a sense of connection. So purpose and connection. And the thing is, why that transition? There's a neat little book I actually picked up in Melbourne Airport, Ikigai. I don't know if anybody's seen it. It's a lovely, if you've read it?
I haven't read it, I've seen it.
It's lovely, it's great. I've just got halfway through it, just about on the flight down yesterday. It's just, but what they're saying, and I've had no reason to doubt it, is the Japanese actually don't have a word for retire. They don't have a word that says to permanently leave the workforce. One of my clients in New Zealand is Mercy Hospital in Dunedin. And when we were doing work with them, I said to them, so how do the sisters handle this when they were involved in the hospital? They're not now. Well, a sister doesn't retire, but the Mother Superior has a conversation and says maybe you need to rethink your contribution. But you're still part of that community. And I think that's what's happened, and we need to do this when I come to rethinking retirement, is get rid of this notion of it. There's you're suddenly done for, you're suddenly redundant. And you need to find other ways to an actual transition. But we'll come back to that. Okay, what other implications?
One thing I thought of is that what we discussed was if when you perhaps died when you're like 67 or something, or 70, you might have been really sick for 2 or 3 years. If you're living to 100, does that mean you're maybe really sick for 10 years? And then
Yeah.
We've done work in residential care and stuff, and you see a lot of people there that are, you know, they're not very well.
Well, the quality of life. What we tend to know, and this is in general, is we're seeing what people, the gerontologists are calling compressed morbidity. So that period of dependency is much more compressed towards the end rather than being chronic over a longer period of time. Now, I was just saying to Pam before, but there's a sleeper sitting in there, and that's the health status of people in their 40s and 50s in Australia. So there's a sleeper sitting in there in terms of diabetes, in terms of obesity, which is going to start to get played out in terms of early exits from the workforce and be taken through for a much longer period in people's lives. So one of the things that the World Health Organization says is that you need to think about the process of aging from the midpoint between birth and life expectancy. So just take, for example, you take life expectancy being, say, at 80, and well, we'll take 90. You need to be investing in aging from the age of 45. And yet what we would say is that it's often that period in your 50s which is the rush hour of life. And you're not wanting to think about aging. And that's why we're changing the language to not be talking about old, but to be talking about as we age. And what do you need to be thinking about in your 40s in terms of career? What do you need to be thinking about in your 40s in terms of finance for a longer life? What do you need to be thinking about in 40s, and it's never too late, but in terms of investment in your health for a longer life? Yeah. Okay, well, here's 6 implications. It's a wonderful book, and I wish I'd thought of the title myself. Grattan and Scott wrote a book about 2 years ago called The 100-Year Life. Has anybody read it? Really interesting book about the 100-year life. And they say there's 6 implications, the way we think about work. That we might have periods of work, periods of gap years, periods of non-work, in and out, but that has all sorts of implications. But no longer is it just this linear piece. Education and training. Most definitely the need to be able to re-engage in education, re-engage in training at different periods in your life. Rather than simply education being that thing you do until you get a job, and then maybe you go off and do a bit of postgrad or graduate certificate or whatever. But that education is an ongoing process, and governments need to get their heads around that. Financing a longer life, which we've talked about. Relationships. Does anybody know, we know what a ruby wedding is, and we know what a diamond wedding is, and a golden wedding anniversary. Does anybody know what, for someone who's been married 80 years is called? A miracle. Do you know what it's called? See, this is
life sentences.
Yeah. It's called Oak. And I was running a group with a group of actually council workers, and one guy sitting there, he said, he said, my neighbours just celebrated that. 80 years. Isn't it amazing? But we also know that with longer life, people may in actual fact be repartnering in their 60s and 70s and 80s. There's discussion now going on around the whole issue of people whose partners have Alzheimer's and what the legal status of relationships that emerge through that period is. Now that's a new discussion. And that's one of the impacts of longevity that we need to be thinking through. Health and well-being. Obviously, that's sitting in there as part of longevity. It's about a much longer life. And it's about how do you avoid that thing of being chronically ill from the age of 50 for the next 40 years, if you make it, and being dependent. And what's the cost of that going to be? But at the personal level, what are you doing to invest in your longer life? So one of the things you can start to see here is that typically when we've thought about longevity, we've thought about it as being those bonus years at the end. I no longer talk about the longevity bonus because it just is now. And it kind of says what you've got to focus on is the piece at the end. What longevity is about is the whole of the life course. So you can start to see that these things here have implications for you as a young graduate. They have implications for me. They have implications for people at all life stages. The fact that we now have this different way of thinking about life and leisure. So those are 6 implications that come out as we start to get our heads around this thing of longevity and move away from saying this is actually about an ageing population, ageing workforce. No, it's not. We need to reframe into thinking longevity. Okay, if we do a bit of practice stuff, and I just want to throw some of this in here. That means we need to be rethinking some of the practice, and I'm going to introduce what Dennis is doing a bit later because it comes up again. But what's emerged in the UK, and now we're seeing in Australia, is the opportunity for people to have mid-career reviews. Now we're doing some of that. We have 3 workshops now that we run, one which is for people in their 30s and 40s, taking charge of your life. How do you create that future? Our Revitalise one has always been for people in their 50s who kind of suddenly wake up one day and say, oh, I'm 50, I could be working for another 20 years, what's it going to be about? And I'm just not going to sit around being disengaged. And there are a number of people who do that. You bump into people and you know them who in their 50s and 60s are just doing their time. What a miserable way to live, I reckon. Why waste that period? Why not rethink and re-engage with your working life? And then the future beyond work, and we don't do retirement planning seminars because it just reinforces that notion. We'll let the financial people do that. But we do help people explore a future beyond work, which I think was your question, was what do you do with that gap and how do you fill it and how do you make those transitions?
I think for me though, Geoff, it was, my mother lived into her late 80s, she was 88, but she had dementia for 10 years.
Yeah.
So I've got this bubble that says, geez, I'm 63 now, do I burn my life out really quickly before I have dementia myself?
Yeah,
yeah. So the window narrows if you use that thought process.
And those are the questions that you need to be thinking about. What many, and I'm careful here, no, I'm going to tell it bluntly, what much of the narrative is about is how are you going to finance that part of your life? No, what you're wanting to think about is how do I live that part of my life? And how do I ensure that I do the things that I want to do when I want to do them, when I'm able to? And you might get a bonus. And I know that's one of the things we often say to people is, what's your family history? That's no guarantee. It could go either way. But you're right. You need to be thinking through, what is it I want to be doing in this next part of my life? Absolutely. Second trend, rethinking retirement. This is interesting. About 2 years ago, I was approached by someone in New Zealand, called Claire Hortala from HT Group, and they had been contracted by 3 big companies who had suddenly realised that there was this new life stage. And they were interested in what people in their from 55, they were looking at 55 to 70, were thinking, what were some of their consumer needs, and how could they tap into that market. And Claire retained me as an advisor, and we've become good friends, and the research she's done, I think, is internationally leading research. And I want to just share that very, very quickly with you, because I think there's some good insights there. She called it the Freedom Seekers, Baby Boomers Navigating Longevity. It was a national study. They interviewed 62 people aged 55 to 70. The people didn't know they were being interviewed because they're that age. They were just being interviewed because she wanted to talk to them about life. If they knew they were being interviewed because at that age, they would have given her the stereotypical answers. And she didn't want that. She just wanted conversations about life. Did lots of things, about a 3-hour in-depth interview. Because one of the companies was a food manufacturer, they also kept food diaries, which found out some very interesting things about what people eat and when they eat at this life stage. And then played it off against a whole lot of other data, and she did some intergenerational research too. What I want to share with you is just very, very quickly, because this is quite a lot of detail in this, but I won't give that to you now. But what she found was that there were 3 cross-cutting themes. Irrespective of who she talked to, 3 themes came through very, very strongly. And the first one was that people were motivated the motivation for freedom was much more powerful than anything to do with retirement. This group did not talk about retirement. What they talked about was freedom. Freedom from work, freedom to be, freedom deferred. And that was just such a consistent theme that came through. And that starts to say to us, don't try and engage this group by talking about retirement. It works for a small part, and I'll show you the small part it does work for. But what people were motivated by was a sense of freedom. Freedom to be, freedom to explore, freedom from work, freedom to work, freedom to contribute in different ways. The second theme that came through very strongly was press pause. You know, you press the pause button and you just hold life. She said there was a sense of, this is our time. We are not yet old. I am not yet dead. There is this period of time in here, this new life stage we talk about, that has emerged for us to be and to do as we want. And then the third thing that came through was around age. Age is a state of mind, not of body. So people didn't want to talk about age, but they talked a lot about well-being. They talked a lot about health and the way in which they wanted to be healthy, to be able to do the things and to experience the freedom. But it wasn't about age. What they might say is, look, I'm feeling really healthy for my age. Surprise, surprise. You know, it's quite funny. I don't know whether you notice, I can say this as I get into my later part of my 60s, and my good old mate here, he said it to me yesterday. He says, mate, you're looking good. Do you ever find that as you get older, people say to you, you're looking good, almost surprised that you shouldn't?
I didn't know.
But it's true. I've started to notice it. And they don't ever say you're looking good for your age, but that's kind of the sub... No, I wouldn't have been. Then she found that there was a range of orientations. Now, these are not categories, but these were orientations that people had to life. There were the group, and you'll know these people, there were a group who were the prosperous enterprisers. They tended to be people that had businesses, were going into business again with their kids, were looking for the next opportunity. They tended to have more wealth, and they tended to they might travel. These are the ones when we did the food diaries, were having brunch, about 10 o'clock after they'd been to the gym or been bike. You know this group, the prosperous enterprises, they're sitting in retirement. No, that's not what it's about. This is about our time, and we're enjoying life. We're putting together in quite different ways. The second group were the purpose seekers. So people who had a strong sense of contribution and purpose, and that age wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was the ability to contribute more flexibly, to leave a legacy. And that's where I would sit. In terms of still having some things that I want to contribute, some things I want to do, but also wanting some more flexibility to come to Tasmania and go to a show in Melbourne on the way across. And to do that during the week when I don't have to fly for leave. But there's that sort of flexibility that people are looking for, but still that sense of wanting to contribute. There were the retirement braces. So these were people in the group that she found who were looking forward to retirement, were enjoying their retirement. What she tended to find there was these were people who had retired from, but hadn't necessarily retired to. So they were wanting to get out of a work environment. Their work situation might not have been satisfactory. And this was a time to move on from that. And they were embracing it. Now what she also found, and this resonates with my observations, is this is the group who have the bucket list. The things they've deferred. And now I'm going to get on and do it. And this is, in the Australian context, the superannuation industry thinks everybody is a retirement embracer. Just have a look at their literature, have a look at the images they use. I did a presentation last year up in Brisbane, and I put up the images. If you just do this one day, get onto Google and just do images retirement. You would think that everybody in Australia who retires is white, heterosexual, loves sitting on a beach and drinking wine. Is that true? You just go and have a look at the images that typically come out. That's the retirement embraces. The fourth group she found was what she called the reluctant sloggers. These are the people who have had stuff happen to them in life. Maybe they've lost money, they've had health issues, they've had broken relationships, they've had periods of unemployment, and then they still are aspiring to being retired, but not yet. It's freedom deferred. These were the groups she found, in actual fact, who were the better budgeters. The others aren't. It was what she found was back up in here, because it's just life's just got on. Like the retirement braces tend to be people who made a lot of contribution to community and to family, but just got on with it. This lot were the better budgeters. And also much more aware of, well, used more convenience food, which was an interesting aside. And then she had the seasoned survivors. And these were people who, she's got a nice little video of a woman who's a Māori woman covered in tats who spent time in the gangs. She spent time on drugs. Claire wasn't too sure whether she was still on drug or not. But people who just have had life tough, and they don't have expectations necessarily about longevity. But what they talk about was that the body's broken down. But I still got something to contribute. I want to contribute to my makapuna or to my grandchildren. I want to help keep other kids out of trouble. So what this research really just said is that, actual fact, not everybody's dreaming of retirement. And that's not the basis of discussion. Yeah.
Geoff, so was this sort of directly related to how financially well off they all were?
No, it wasn't. What I would say is that the Prosperous Enterprises had got to that point in life because they had probably managed finances well and were able to have that sort of lifestyle. And maybe the purpose seekers were people who were still able to earn some income but were balancing life. But a lot of it was actually about values and about the cards that life had dealt people. And I'll come to I'll say it now and I'll repeat it later. The ageism thing is really interesting. The World Health Organization's has got very good research that shows that the difference in life expectancy between people who have a positive orientation to aging and a negative orientation to aging is around about 7.5 years. So if you want to live longer, get your head sorted is basically the message. And what you'll tend to find, and this is just an assumption, but you'll tend to find longer life expectancy at that. And that's because of health, but it's also because of mental maps. It's the way people think about it. And what she found in their finance wasn't the thing that was driving people. That's an Australian narrative, which I think is not helpful. Okay, so that's a really, I think, an interesting piece of research that has us rethinking what this life stage is about. And that has obvious implications for people staying on and work. So we always say that when we see people who are staying on at work through choice, and you see that in Claire's research, people who are staying on through necessity, and that most often is financial necessity, but it also may be, in actual fact, necessity in terms of still wanting to remain engaged and feel as though they've got a sense of value and contribution. So more the psychological benefits that come from being involved in work. And some who stay on and work through fear because they're just simply frightened of the alternatives. They've seen too many people die 6 months after they finish work, so why would you leave work, really? These are the numbers in Australia that, and as I say, Australia's had a low participation rate. Up 2016, about 430 odd thousand. 2019 figures, these are just fresh out. Around about 610, 611,000 people over 65 are still going to work here in Australia. Part-time, full-time, whatever. Now, you wouldn't believe that if you listen to the media. I remember saying to a very good colleague and friend in Brisbane, Cameron knows, to Katrina one day, that you would think that the only older workers that existed in Australia were those who couldn't get work. And that's all you hear about. Except in Australia today, over 600,000 people over 65 are still going to work. And we don't hear that discussion. We don't hear the discussion with our employers around what does that mean? What does that mean when someone goes to see Dennis at the age of 68 and says, I want to still stay and work? That's important. Or my job's at risk. I'm not unemployed, my job's at risk, but I still want to contribute. I want to do it maybe more flexibly. And that's a discussion that's going to be needed to be had. Okay, well, we've also do some research. When we run groups with people over 50, we get them to fill out a survey, a questionnaire around what some of their preferences are, what they'd be looking for in the workplace. We've now got 975 in that database, so we've got pretty good numbers. This is Australia, New Zealand, there's a slight difference. But we asked people to rate 15 different line items in terms of what they would like to see, what they would like for themselves. And I'd take out the 4 and the 5, so 4 is where they rated on a 1 to 5 scale. I'd be really interested in this if it was available. And number 5 is I'd really like to have this or I'd already have it. Well, guess what comes up top? People want access to financial and life stage advice to prepare for the next stage in their lives. 81% of people across that 975 have said that's one of the things I really want. People also want access to health and wellbeing services and advice, which is a very interesting thing. They're saying, actually, I want information. I want good information that is life stage related. And Cameron knows this, I often say, is that wellbeing programs are often constructed in the image of the wellbeing coordinator and their life issues. We need to be getting wellbeing programs that actually speak to the different life stages. I did this big piece of work with a retail chain in New Zealand. It was a predominantly female workforce. And one of the things we said in groups of people over 50, we said, so what are some of your health concerns? What are the health issues that you worry about most? What do you think was the top number one health concern that these people told me about? You're right on it. You're one of the first people to actually go to that. People do always sort of sit there and think it, but don't say it. Menopause. Now, how many wellbeing programs have education around menopause in them? And do we talk about it in the workplace? And the guy said, and it affects us too. We work with women, we live with women, we want to be understanding, we want to be able to work in a supervisory relationship or whatever, or with a supervisor who is going through this life stage. And yet it's not in there, and it needs to be in there because of what's happening. Then what do you think came next? No, but it was pretty well up there, cancer. But then dementia came, and both of them had the same side to it. Was, particularly with the cancer one, is I'm afraid I may have, or I am in remission, or a family member has, and the anxiety that brings into the workplace. Now, Cancer Society in New Zealand, in fact, say the thing we love is to actually go into workplaces and do education programs, because that's where we can reach people. Third thing, reducing the part-time work. Fourth, interesting and challenging work. I was working with a group in Brisbane about 4 weeks ago. I've got a colleague in Brisbane now, Beck, and I were working with this group. It was a government agency. And 2 of their staff had actually been out. We'd got them to go out and interview a group of older workers in their company, in their government agency, about what were the things that mattered to them. And they came back and they said to these senior managers, they said, one of the things that staff are telling us, older staff are telling us, is when you put out a request of interest in a secondment or a project, it's always the people on a career path who get those placements. And they say, we understand why, but actually we want to do interesting and challenging work. And we think we've got a contribution to make at the age of 55 to those projects. That was a massive wake-up call. What the older workers were saying is, don't treat us as people who are on a glide path out. If you want us to be engaged, we've got things we want to contribute. Now, we're not wanting to go on those projects for promotion or as part of succession, but we do want to be involved in contributing and giving back and doing meaningful work. Does that make sense to you? Don't overlook us. They wanted access to mentoring and access to training and development. Okay, how are we going? All right? I'm not ready to retire, so what are some of my options? Mark Friedman says, when we think about this whole new map of life, there's really two things that comes through, and I've said those before, and that's purpose and connection are the two keys to living well with these added years. So, and this is the space where Dennis is working in too, that we need to be thinking much more about work in quite different ways. And like I lost a job twice in my late 50s, and the last job, the employer did the right thing. They said you can go off and see a career advisor, and you get 3 sessions, one to do CV writing, one to do job set, one to do interview skills. And I was 58 and a professional. I said, thanks very much. Do you mind if I use them differently? Now what I do, I would look back and say, I didn't know these words then. I actually used 6 sessions to work out what I wanted to do with the next part of my life. And I think if employers think that they've discharged their responsibilities by sending people off to do that, they have missed the mark. They've simply set people up for frustration. They've set themselves up for what one person calls the 100 no's. That what we need to be working with people at that life stage is around thinking through, how do you want to spend the next part of your life? What's the contribution you want to make? And how do you want to participate in work, not necessarily employment? Because employment assumes an employer. I don't have an employer. And there's a lot of other people who don't. But if you come back, the options that sit in there in terms of employment, people are able to maybe renegotiate, retrain, redeploy. Are the sort of options that sit in there for people if they're able to. But there's a whole thing around encore careers. Mark Friedman's area basically found that a lot of people over 50 were doing what he called an encore career, the performance after the main performance. They were taking their skills from one sector and taking it to another sector, maybe taking it from commercial world or government world and taking it to the not-for-profit NGO sector. Accountants, lawyers, IT specialists, whatever, planners. Change is where Mark talks about the sort of thing that probably you did, Dennis, is helping people actually in fact change careers and go back and retrain for the next part of what they want to be doing. And it may be something quite different that actually picks up on a whole passion that they've had and a set of values and drivers that are important. Or he says the other one you've got in there is to make. So you might have some sort of hobby or activity that you've got that you can turn into an income stream. Although one of the things that we're reading a lot more about now is that in actual fact, if you've got a hobby and you turn it into a business, it can kill the hobby. And that's a risk. It changes the whole nature of it. You can buy a business. So we see people often buying a business or getting a franchise. And the area I'm really interested in is senior entrepreneurship. Certainly in the States, we know this is the case. There are more people going into business over the age of 50 than there are aged 18 to 30. And those businesses survive longer, and about 60% of them are social enterprises. And that's the research we're doing now in New Zealand. We're interviewing 20 people over 50 who have gone into business for the first time and finding out what their drivers were and what's important to them. But more and more you're going to see that people at that life stage, I went into business at 61, going into business for the first time, and it's an option that needs to be there and talked about and supported. And then it may well be through volunteer work where contribution, connectedness and purpose becomes the benefit that comes back from it. Okay, let's talk about number 3. Or any breathers, any questions there? I've covered a lot of ground, but this is designed to provoke thinking. Any questions so far? Observations? Comments?
I find that the Where at Work and the construction industry, and there's a lot of people there that are tradies and things like that, and they get physically worn out.
Yep.
Maybe that'll change in the future with new equipment.
Yeah, I
stuff
think
like that.
could well be a legacy thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of those people find it pretty hard to keep doing the same activity
Absolutely.
after 50 or 60.
Yeah.
I don't know how that sort of works.
Yeah. What I say to that is, actually employers, you want to do the right thing by your employees, give them the opportunity, particularly in the trades of hard physical work in their late 40s and early 50s, to do a career rethink. I've got a neighbour he's a builder. He's in his mid-40s, he's just had spinal fusion. And he said, I can't keep doing this. And I said, so Toby, what are you thinking? He said, I might need to come and have a talk with you. He says, because I want to keep working, but I just can't keep doing this. And he owns a building business. What's he going to do? He loves being on the tools. And so there's a need to be working through with people around those sort of things, rather than them just simply holding in there until they burn and crash. Is that what you see, Dennis?
Yeah, quite a few trainees are really worn out by the time they're 50, depending on different individuals. But we've managed to find some training for those people to do to transition to something that they can use some of that skills they've learned in those trades and into a new career. So.
Yeah. And what sort of careers are some of them going into?
Well, some are changing totally.
Yeah.
Total change. One guy, Boilermaker, is gone into engineering drawing. So he's using all those practical skills. Yeah. Doing a course in engineering drawing. He thinks he might have lined up a job. He's found someone that will probably take him on. So, he can keep working.
Yeah. That must be hugely satisfying work for you.
Yeah, it is.
It's a difficult transition, mate. I'm tradie, I'm an electrician.
Yeah. And you've moved into being an inspector.
10 or 11 years ago,
yep.
Things were starting to ache and hurt, and it's hard work. And so I decided to transition into safety. So I started out my own time, Cert 4 WHS, found the role in that, kept progressing up, worked in private enterprise, and made a transition across to here. It's a big change because you're leaving your mates on the work floor and you're suddenly classed as
gone to the dark side.
Who sits in the dark side. It's a difficult transition to make.
Yeah.
And there's often not a lot of support there from your work mates for doing that transition.
Yeah.
And management, they're not always on side of you making that transition because they're losing a set of hands out of the floor.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's the sort of discussions that we need to be, and this is what I'm going to talk about this afternoon with the insurance guys, these are the sort of discussions we've got to be starting to have. Because people, as we know from longevity, we've got to finance a longer life, we're going to be healthier longer, we want to stay engaged and contributing, but I can't keep doing what I was doing at the age of 20.
I've still got mates who've got their own businesses. I'm originally from Queensland. They've got businesses up there, and they are absolutely knackered. Yeah. I'm 51, they're in their 50s as well. Yeah. And most of them, luckily enough, have got other people working for them. They've built up good-sized businesses, but physically they are completely...
Yeah.
And I think some of those people, like, you look at the Rio guys and things like that, concreters, they've probably gone into that work because that's what they're sort of able to do, and that's what. So it's not that easy to go to somewhere with paperwork. They might be able to read and write for a start. So it's really hard for them to go to something that's not a physical, hands-on job.
And that's why I'm really excited about what the government has done funding or contracting busy work to do this. I think this is an amazing service. It ties with what we know out of the UK research around needing to have what they call the midlife career check, or the MOT they actually call it.
It's difficult making that first step. Like, I got no support from my employer. No. And they were one of Australia's biggest employers. They did not want to pay for my transition into safety. Yeah. So I had to do it in my own time and pay for it myself. So you've got to have that commitment to do that change.
All right, well, let's keep rolling. It's a good discussion. This is one of the implications that we're seeing. It's a global trend. It's just starting to emerge, where we're needing to get employers to be starting to think about this, but government's been able to think about what are you going to do to retain people rather than burn them out and spit them out in their 50s. or end up with them on workers' compensation, the huge lump sum payments and all the rest that goes with that. Okay, the third thing I want to talk about is ageism. This is an interesting discussion in that there's some subtleties in here. And what I want to say before I open this up is that ageism is real. Just keep those words in mind as I talk, because I'm then going to start to say, in actual fact, I think it's overplayed in some places. But it's real. Okay, so I'm not saying it's not there. In actual fact, the arguments made by World Health Organization is that ageism is far more pervasive than sexism or racism. It's pervasive, it's embedded in our society and in our thinking, and people experience it in quite different ways. But I think the first thing we need to be clear about is what I call the anatomy of ageism. That with any ism, we could use this around racism, we could use this around gender too, that we need to be thinking about the beliefs, the attitudes and the behaviours. And typically what we have talked about, or we hear talked about in relation to ageism, is the behaviours. Because the agenda around older workers has been driven, certainly in the past, not so much now in the current person, by the Age Discrimination Commissioner. And their exposure is about dealing with discriminatory behaviours related to age. And what that research says out of there is that typically there are two groups who experience discrimination on the basis of age. The older and the younger are the two that experience it. What have we got going on? A bit of a tune. What we need to push back to is an actual start to thinking about challenging some of the beliefs and the stereotypes that exist in our thinking. Now, a lot of this is laid down as, has anybody done unconscious bias training and awareness? We know that most of this is laid down before the age of 4. Anybody see the ABC program this last week on the 4-year-olds who went into the aged care facility? I just saw the shorts and I thought it was absolutely amazing. The interactions that were going on, but the shaping of that would be in those kids' minds around older people, and they were positive interactions, I suspect, on the whole. But it's also about attitudes that then get expressed as prejudice. I've got a colleague who now works with me in Brisbane, and she said to me, she says, since she's been working with me, I've absolutely stuffed up her choice of birthday cards. If you want to see ageism at work, go and look at birthday cards. It is all played out there. That people, I can't buy those cards now. This is the World Health Organization research, 7.5 years between positive and negative ages. And this is about your own self-beliefs about your age. So you will all know people who you will say who are old beyond their years. They talk and act old. Now I've got a sister-in-law and brother-in-law who are, sister-in-law's younger, 10 years younger than my wife, and my wife's same age as me. And she told us several months ago, she said, you've got to realise, she says, that we're now old age pensioners. Bollocks, get off the grass, live life. and it's that mental model that we adopt that we then start, if we go back to our attitudes and beliefs, we then start to play that out as behaviours. And we can play that out in terms of age. Viktor Frankl, does anybody know Viktor Frankl's work, who I talk about? Viktor Frankl went through the concentration camps. He's the founder of logotherapy. He survived, no, he more than survived the concentration camps. And his whole thing was that those who survived and even prospered were people who, in the face of adversity, had a strong sense of why and a strong sense of purpose. And he wrote, he said, the way in which we imagine our futures will affect our longevity. And so this comes back to our own beliefs about longevity, our own beliefs about the aging process will affect us. Philip Taylor is an associate of ours. He's a researcher at Federation University. Last year he had the Glenda Powell Travelling Fellowship with the Australian Association of Gerontology. And he did a controversial piece of research. Controversial because it didn't support necessarily the established view. And what he said is there's a need to consider how age discrimination at any age intersects with gender, race and disability discriminations as well as other contextual factors. Now, one of the things that, there's a phrase that's often used in this area called intersectionality, is that age doesn't exist on its own. Age is related to gender, to ethnicity, to disability, and you've got to be looking at the intersection of those things playing out, so you can't just look at age on its own. And so he had to look at a whole lot of Australian data. It was a big database around discrimination in the workplace. And what he said is it was found that everyday discrimination affects a minority of workers overall, with the younger men more likely to experience it in some forms than older men. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it, from his data. By contrast, there's no evidence in this study to support the contention that gendered ageism, at least as it's commonly defined, acts as a double jeopardy for older women. So what he was saying there was there's a view that you are both female and older, so therefore you're more likely to be. He didn't find that evidence. Rather, it appears that women's everyday experience of discrimination is the same, whatever age they are. Kind of interesting. The extent of discrimination affecting older Australian workers may have been overstated. What he does say is that the cohort, the data that he had was people in employment. Now, I'm saying that really clearly because the distinction is the discourse and the narrative we hear around age discrimination is about people who are wanting to move back into employment. And therefore you hear, a la, Australian workplaces discriminate against older workers. Yes, at the point of recruitment and also subtly internally, but it may not be in terms of behaviour, it could well be in terms of attitudes and beliefs that get expressed in another way, and I'll come to that in a minute. So I'm not saying that age discrimination does not exist within the workforce, but when we talk about it, we've got to be a bit more clear about what we're talking about. Okay, does that make sense to you? A little more clearer. New Zealand, and may well be the same here, there was a survey of working life conducted October, December. They asked people about their work arrangements, employment conditions, satisfaction with their job. This comes out of Stats NZ, which is the same as your ABS. The question they asked is, have you experienced bullying, harassment, discrimination in the workplace? Good question. They've wrapped the three in together. This is the distribution of over 2,000 respondents. I went back to them and said, can you give me the age distribution? This is what we got. So what we found was, in actual fact, the concentration, and it was very little variance on the norm, so the norm average was 12%, but in that 45 to 59 period. Now, if you were taking the normal narrative that you hear, you would be expecting it to be at that end and at that end. So again, what that's saying is people are experiencing harassment, bullying, discrimination in the workforce, but generally it's across the ages. Now, what's that?
It's standard distribution.
It is. It's just it's the bell curve. It sits there, rather than being concentrated at both ends, which it is in terms of complaints to the Age Discrimination Commissioner, and that's complaints. But we know there's other stuff going on in the workplace. Let's talk about two other pieces of research. One is the Harvard Project Implicit. Have people heard of the Project Implicit? You have? So you can go online, you can do a questionnaire online which gives you some feedback around both explicit and implicit biases across a whole range of different categories. The really good thing about this data is that it's open source data. And there's a piece of research that's just come out where the researchers took a subset of 4 million tests that were collected continuously over 10 years to see what had happened over that 10 years period in terms of change. Very, very interesting. Long-term change was observed across multiple implicit attitudes, and that was sexuality, race, and skin tone attitudes. So they could see that change had happened around the implicit ways in which people thought about these areas. So gender, race, and skin tone. Age attitudes revealed only slight change over that period, about a 5% move in parallel with explicit. Indeed, age attitudes revealed the largest difference between rates of explicit and implicit. So what they were saying, there were some changes in the explicit, but in actual fact, over that period, people's attitudes and biases towards age had not changed significantly. There was another category too. What do you think it would have been where there's been very little change? Disability. The interesting thing in there is if you start to talk to organisations about diversity and inclusion, or if you have a look, it's interesting, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a study of multinationals across the globe who already have in place diversity and inclusion strategies. Only 8% of them included age as an area they needed to look at in terms of age, diversity and inclusion. Only 8%. That age drops off the end, disability drops off the end. The narrow discussion is always about gender, ethnicity and sexual preference. Hence, we're seeing the shift in terms of implicit attitudes. That research is simply reflecting what's going on in terms of education and awareness. So that starts to suggest to us what we need to be doing in terms of age. The other study is a really nice one that came out of University of Melbourne and University of South Australia. And there's a nice little video goes with this, and we use it in training. What they looked at was 600 workers across Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide. And what they found, without going into too much detail, is that organisations that had in place high performance practices, such as good team participation, good feedback, coaching, all of those top line HR practices that you get taught and expect to see in organisations, it made diddly squat difference in terms of older workers' engagement. What made the difference was when you coupled it with mature age practices. So if organisations come back to me and say we've got really good HR practices, we've got all this in place, what this research would say is it actually will make not much difference in terms of engaging older workers, because what plays out in there is what we call stereotype threat. And that's where people start to take on the negative attitudes and beliefs about age and play them out. And you probably hear it. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. How many older workers tell you that? I'm sorry, you can. I'm not much good at computers because I'm getting older, you know. Rubbish. I'm a bit slower at the job now, I'm getting older, so don't hassle me. Actually, no, you're just taking a bit longer to process what's happening. And you've got a lot more you need to accommodate and accumulate. But when people take on those stereotype threats, it then feeds into disengagement and loss of productivity. And so what we need in place, in actual fact, is both within organisations. Well, this is the last piece of comment I'll make on ageism. I'm starting to see a new ageism emerge, which is very, very worrying. If we define ageism as stereotypes, prejudice or discrimination against or in favour of a particular age group, then we've got an emerging issue. And that is that. I've just been in the States. If I heard the word millennial once more, I was going to scream. I was talking to someone the other day, actually in New Zealand, who works in this, and she was a younger person. She contacted me, and she said, you know, one of the things that I work really hard at is building bridges between generations. She said, what's your thinking on that? I said, well, you only have to have a bridge if you've created a chasm. If you don't have a chasm, if you don't have a river, you don't have to have a bridge. And it's this that's creating chasms. There is absolutely no scholarly research that supports the existence of these categories. These categories have been created by marketers. And then they've been adopted by keynote speakers, HR specialists, who suddenly say therefore they exist. And so I said this to someone, and they sent me a piece of research from the Pew Institute in the States that had all these categories, and these are the attributes. But none of that research had actually questioned, do those categories exist? What we know from racism, we know this from gender politics, is that at the point when we create an other, we're in trouble. Now, one of the interesting things about ageism is that if you discriminate on the basis of age, you are discriminating against your future self, because we all age. And every other category, we create others who we will never be. So you may have beliefs about Muslims, you may have beliefs about gays, you may have beliefs about transgender. You will not be those, you are different from when you create those beliefs. But in age, you are going to age. So in actual fact, you're discriminating against your future self. So, best practice. Education awareness. We've got to start myth busting around some of the stuff around ageing. Unconscious bias training and awareness does not work when it's a one-off. What we need to be doing is continuing to challenge ourselves and to be thinking about how our biases that were laid down in those early parts of our lives continue to play out through the way we think and see. And if anybody tells me I haven't got any unconscious biases, where have you been? Explicit older worker programs. Programs in actual fact that do gauge with people as they age at work and deal with some of that stereotype threat. Inclusive language and narratives and intergenerational initiatives. Okay, trend 4, and I've got 10 minutes to run. Future workforce. These are some interesting projections that have been done. If you have a look, the bottom line is the current labour force and the top line is labour demand. So if you come into China, which is probably a really interesting one, is that the labour force, the supply of labour, this is where we are now, is going to decline. That's the one-child family thing. But the demand for labour is going to go that way. Yeah, that way. So what you've got occurring in here is a gap that's starting to emerge. If you go to Japan, you get the same thing. Here's Australia. So while there's going to be an increase in supply, the increase in demand is going to be greater. And this is irrespective of artificial intelligence, fourth industrial revolution, all that sort of talk. And this is what people are now starting to talk about, is this gap that is emerging between supply and demand. It is no longer the old thing of the cyclical skill shortages. This is a permanent movement that is happening. So what that starts to suggest to us is that we need to start thinking, and this is where this thing, start thinking about this quite differently. So now I no longer talk about recruitment and retention. That's typically the way in HR we've talked about recruitment and retention. You've got to get people and you've got to keep them. No, we put it the other way around. Retention and recruitment. Start focusing in HR on retention. Get your recruitment specialist to deal down here, but be focused and put your energy into keeping the people that you've got. Because there are not people out there queuing up looking for work. I don't know, what's the current unemployment rate in Tasmania?
6.2% or something.
Yeah, that's quite high. Yeah, what's it in Australia?
5.
5. New Zealand, we're now down about 3.8. And you need to be sitting at about 4 to have a dynamic labour market. I was working in an area in Southland, the south part in Invercargill last year, and their unemployment rate is down to about 1.8%. They can't get workers.
It's on age though, doesn't it? Because there's a lot higher unemployment in younger people.
Yeah, but this is across the... No, I'll come back to that and challenge that one, Pam. I'm not so sure. But the gap they found was that there was only 1.8% people unemployed. Now, what I said to them, and you can check this data for yourself, very few people do this, is go and have a look at the age profiles of people who are registered for New Start. And to do it by age. Now, we've got a thing we call Register for Job Support, which is not for a welfare benefit, it's for job support. Currently in New Zealand, there's more people registered for job support 55 to 65 than there are aged 18 to 25. Now, that doesn't mean we don't focus on youth and employment. We absolutely do. But there's this other group up there who are not in work and who are taking themselves out early and saying, I'm retired, because they don't want to face the 100 no's through trying to seek work and facing prejudice and discrimination at the point of employment, and they exit from the labour market early. So at that point, there is a significant labour market sitting in there that we've got to get our heads around and not simply just be thinking this is about keeping more and more young people into work. Yes, we do, because they've got a long term and contribution and we know all those sort of issues. But there is a labour market sitting in here of people who are living longer, wanting and needing to contribute longer, and who in actual fact are exiting earlier. So just go and check those figures, Pam, because it's a piece of received wisdom that just does not stack up when I've certainly looked at the data. I said that at this meeting in Invercargill, and there was an ex-politician, she sat there and she said, no, that's not true. So I went home that night and had a look at the data, and I came back and said, there's your data. And she said, wow, no one knows that. No one is talking about that. And what they did was then develop a program where they sat down with people 55 plus and said, what are you looking for? What would help you get back into work? What would help you participate? All government funding is going into youth participation, but there's a whole other labour market here. Would that be what you observed, Dennis?
Well, certainly the cohort that I work with are 45 to 70, so...
Yeah. That's recognising that they're there. And the beauty with this program, and you've got some flyers you can leave afterwards, is that people can participate in it or while they're still in employment. If they are facing the risk of becoming out of employment and being on welfare support.
And that's a pretty open-ended definition as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you can be at risk for a number of reasons. A lot of people are in casual employment. A lot of people are just struggling at work, can't cope physically or with the other demands of the job. So it's a very open definition at risk. Yeah.
The long-term gap between supply and demand, are many governments looking at immigration as a way of solving that?
They have in the past. I'm sorry, it's not going to work in the future. We are now looking at a global labour market. And in the short term, up until now, Western countries have tended to look other places for labour. But what have you seen in the Trumpian era? A tightening up on that. And Australia, New Zealand are no different in terms of pulling back on immigration. And it's a global competitive market for this particular. So it's not a solution. And that's the discussion that we need to be having is, what are we doing with what we've got already? How are we engaging the people we've got already? All right, I want to make one more comment and then we'll be through. There's now a trend that is also happening. We've talked a lot about age-friendly in the space, age-friendly cities, communities, age-friendly organisations. The shift now is to talking much more about age inclusiveness. If you go back 10 years ago, the discussion was about diversity in organisation. There was a shift that happened to talking about diversity inclusion, and you know that whole definition of diversity has been invited to the dance, inclusion has been invited to dance. Where the discussion is just a subtle shift that's been happening in the last 6 months is people who are thinking a lot in this space are now talking about inclusion and diversity. And I think this is a key, a possible key around the issue of age, is because organisations will look around and say, we've got age diversity. What are you on about? Well, actually what we're on about is inclusion. And when the pendulum shift is starting with actually inclusion, we might all then start to be asking the question, are people across different life stages in actual fact included and contributing and participating? I want to play for you now a video just to finish out and then maybe take a quick couple of comments. A guy who first challenged me in this area was a guy called Mark Friedman. I've mentioned him several times. I was at a conference in Vancouver, dropped into a lunchtime session, heard him speak, and as they say, everything is history since then for me. And this guy just opened me up to thinking differently about life stages. It's kind of interesting that Mark's work, and he'll talk about this on this very short video clip, started by working with disadvantaged youth. He then moved to working with people over the 50s, and he's now working very much at creating inclusive cultures, intergenerational. And the future, we're saying, is actually to be looking at intergenerational initiatives. He won a prize last year, the Eisner Prize, just don't worry about that, for the work that he was doing. And this was the short YouTube that was made around that prize. But Mark just talks about his own work and where he's got to in terms of thinking. And I'd just like to play that video for you at this point.
What animates the work that I do and what gets me up in the morning, and it's questions of how can we find new ways to do old things. The mission of Encore.org is to create a better future for future generations and to mobilize the vast and growing older population to invest in the well-being of young people. I spent the first 15 years of my working life focused on young people who were growing up in poverty, and I became immersed in what young people needed to overcome the odds and live productive lives. The one thing every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. Today, for the first time ever, we have more older people than younger people. And that's seen as the basis for a huge disconnection between generations. But that's a divide that we can bridge, that we have to bridge.
50 years ago, JFK gave his most important speech on aging. He said we'd added years to life. Now it's time to add life to those years.
The secret to happiness in later life is not trying to be young, but rather to be there for those who actually are. Encore.org realized the intergenerational opportunity, and we want to make sure that we leave the world better than we found it. Our founding project was Experience Corps, which is now in over 20 cities around the country, in which teams of older people help children in low-income schools read by the 3rd grade. We followed Experience Corps with the Purpose Prize, which is a prize for social innovators over the age of 60. Our most recent effort is the Generation to Generation campaign, which is mobilizing a movement of 1 million older people to stand up and show up for the next generation. We created the Encore Fellowships Initiative, which is a 1-year internship for grown-ups who are moving from their midlife career in the private sector and using skills in areas like IT, strategic planning, marketing to help strengthen the capacity of the social sector. The Encore Fellowships program has already had nearly 1,700 fellowships. We're trying to promote not only a culture which supports older people engaged in purposeful and productive ways that benefit future generations, but to create a society where that happens naturally and help build a movement of older people who are deeply invested in the well-being of the next generation.
So longevity's not about more older people simply been hanging around a lot longer. I was interviewed on this by a newspaper back in New Zealand, and I must have told the story that I told you at the beginning about the older woman. And I waited with some anticipation for when this article was to come out in the newspaper. And John McCrone, who was the interviewer, he titled the article "Not Yet Dead," which is kind of interesting. But he said this, he said, "I'm not old. I'm just living a lot longer." And that's where the opportunities are. We haven't got time to talk this through, but these are where I think we need to be thinking, is what are some of the policy implications? What are some of the practice implications in our workplaces for you as leaders in terms of increased longevity, in terms of rethinking the way we approach the whole question of ageism, which is real, but I think we need a much more sophisticated approach to it. The rethinking of retirement and the way in which we need to rethink and change the narrative and the language around it. I don't use the word. The future of the workforce. What are the needs that are sitting in there, and how do we work to retain those that we've got? And then moving to much more of an age-inclusive workplace, but also an intergenerational, multi-generational environment and society. So thanks very much. It's been great to share these thoughts with you. I'm going to be around for a bit longer, happy to sit and chat. And if you are interested in the book, this is the commercial. I've got some here, and I'll do a cash deal today.
Thank you.
Thanks.